Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today with my guest, Kirsten Jackson, aka the IBS Dietitian. Kirsten is a UK registered dietitian specializing in irritable bowel syndrome. She is a fully trained low FODMAP dietitian and has incorporated this diet into her take control method for optimal results. Before becoming a low FODMAP dietitian, Kirsten suffered with IBS herself. After realizing that low FODMAP diet was only part of the answer, she developed the take control method, which incorporates a more holistic approach to support IBS sufferers. I'm looking forward to talking all things IBS in today's show. Kirsten, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here.
Kirsten, I want to go a little bit into your backstory before we start to talk about your method, because as somebody that, and my podcast listeners know this, IBS is something that I want to say, and I said it right before we went on air, struggled with, but something I manage now, I think would be a more accurate description of it. But talk about your backstory, because you suffered with IBS yourself, and that's obviously what got you interested. So talk to us a little bit about that before we kind of jump into some of the solutions and some of the pain points that people have and what they can do about it.
Yes. So I did suffer with it myself. And I think the ironic thing is, as when I got IBS, I was already a registered dietitian. So I hear a lot from my clients, oh, I feel silly. I feel like it's my fault. I should be able to read around this. And I was like, guys, I had like a 4-year degree in dietetics. And at the time, I still couldn't figure it out. So at that point, I knew all the science, probiotics, low FODMAP, all these buzzwords, tried them all, didn't really work. And that's where I realized, the science, you can't argue with it. It's there. So why is this not working? And it was more how we do it rather than what, and rather than throwing everything at the IBS, it's more about having a more structured approach. And that's where this sort of take control method came from, because I've seen firsthand that, IBS, what it can do to someone's life when it's really uncontrolled versus the potential of actually controlling it and living a life, what I say, doing things other people take for granted.
With low FODMAP, because I think the first thing that when anybody Googles IBS solution or what do I do if I have IBS, because I've, as someone that struggled with it, the diagnosis on the front end is frustrating, because it's kind of one of those, when you've ruled everything else out, it's like, well, it must be IBS. So that can be frustrating in the process in itself. But normally when people get to that point, and I'd imagine if they're listening to this episode, they are somewhere on that spectrum in the early stages or potentially in the advanced stages, and they've gone through low FODMAP. Talk to us about what that is, because I think that gives us a nice little jumping off point to where the problem is with it and what's missing from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the low FODMAP diet, and we'll come to this in a little while, is actually something that people shouldn't even be considering to start with yet. For starting at this podcast, as a sign that it is one of the first things people unfortunately come across, because either they Google, go to Dr. Google, or their own doctor will just print out a sheet and say, here you go, you've got IBS, off you go, sort it out on your own. So the low FODMAP diet, for anyone who's listening who's thinking, what the hell is that? It's basically an acronym. So it stands for low, and then it's fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, polyols. And these are basically just different types of carbohydrates that we'd find in various types of food. So things like bread, onions, milk, they all contain FODMAPs. And in everybody, they are quite poorly digested to a certain extent. And they then end up in the large bowel, which is where our gut bacteria is. Now, in people with IBS, these FODMAPs can then cause more gas to be produced, and they can also draw in water. So they can cause things like stomach pain, excess gas, burping, farting, and then loose stools as well. So a whole number of IBS symptoms. So the low FODMAP diet, what it does is it's actually a process. It's not actually a diet. So you have a period where you reduce all of these foods down, normally for around 4 weeks, and then you reintroduce them very systematically, one at a time, to identify or diagnose what the food intolerance is.
With IBS, and I think it's important that we lay this foundation as well, because I had the misconception and confusing leaky gut and IBS. So before we kind of explore diet, mental well-being, sleep, movement, everything that you talk about in the take control method, talk about the difference between leaky gut, IBS, and the potential overlap there, because I think that's important to somebody that was literally banging, well, not literally, figuratively banging my head off a wall trying to fix one thing when the issue was somewhere else. Talk to us about the confusion that comes there.
Yeah, there's a lot of confusion, and it just, at the end of the day, it's born out of people just being left on to their own devices trying to resolve this quite medical condition, and they're trying to make sense of, it in some way. So leaky gut is actually not a condition. So you can get a gut that's leakier. Basically what that means is if you were to get a microscope and look at the walls of your gut, there's lots and lots of cells in there that you would expect, but they're very tightly packed. And that's to stop any kind of bacteria and pathogens coming into your body. And they're very well designed to obviously allow nutrients into the body though. Now, if you have leaky gut, or in the medical world, we would say a more permeable gut, which is, I guess, more of a technical term, then this is when the gut wall can be damaged, and then it starts to allow pathogens and things in. So this is more like a symptom of maybe many conditions. So things like inflammatory bowel disease, someone would have a more permeable gut because they have loads of inflammation that's damaged their gut. Now, there's lots of claims out there around this leaky gut syndrome. And unfortunately, then people get really confused because it's not actually a condition. It's just a symptom of things that can happen. Whereas IBS is an actual condition. It's a really well-defined condition on its own. And someone might have a more permeable gut in IBS, but that's just part of the whole condition. So one's a condition, one's a symptom.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful for people to know as a foundation, because one of the mistakes I made was I used the terms interchangeably in the beginning, and I was trying to fix leaky gut, I was trying to fix IBS, and that, as you can imagine, is very frustrating. If I want to go from, Birmingham to Bristol, or Galway to Dublin, or New York to California, it helps to know what direction you're going with, as opposed to going somewhere that's not planned. And with IBS then, how is it defined, and what would you say with that? Because you can briefly describe it for us. What's the biggest misconception people have when it comes to IBS?
Yeah, so there's two definitions for IBS. One is a functional bowel condition. So there's many functional bowel conditions, but IBS is one of them. And that just means the gut is not functioning properly, and there's no markers available. So there's no signs, there's no inflammatory markers, there's no blood samples we can take to show X is out of Z is happening or whatever. And the other kind of better probably definition would be it's a disorder of the gut-brain axis. And what this means is the brain and the gut, they talk to each other. So the brain talks to the gut talks to the brain in various different pathways, so hormonal, physiological, so nervous system changes, muscle changes. And we know that all those different pathways in IBS, they don't function properly. So a couple of different definitions there. And probably the biggest misconception around IBS is that it's not a real condition. So this can make people feel even crapper basically about the situation, because they think, we're being fobbed off, like this is not a real condition. They keep digging and digging to get a better diagnosis. But it's a really well-defined diagnosis. If anyone's interested, look up the Rome Foundation. They'll give you, it's in black and white, the definition. So this is a very well-defined condition. If you've been given that diagnosis, you've been diagnosed.
Yeah. And thankfully, I think in more recent years, the last 5-10 years, it's, as you said, been medically recognized, and there's people like you putting out tremendous content. Like, Kirsten, when I came across your Instagram page, I remember thinking, wow, I needed this so badly when I was suffering. I'm going to link it in the description for people, because I think anyone that is in that banging their head off a wall phase, you have so much on there that supports them. And we're only touching on some of it in this podcast, so I will link that for people. But with IBS, it was something, as you mentioned there, that is now medically diagnosed, and people say this is what it is. What's the cause? And this is, I know, how long is a piece of string, Pandora's box of a question, but I do think it helps when we start to explain the take control method of why it's more holistic, and your approach needs to be holistic. So talk to us about the causes of IBS.
Yeah, so they don't know exactly 100% concrete what the cause is. So there's lots of scenarios or situations which have been linked to the onset. So those scenarios have been things like trauma or stress. So often if I ask my clients, when your IBS started, did anything change in their life? And sometimes, yes, they moved country, or they had a divorce, or something very stressful. Post-infectious IBS is another one. So someone who's had a gut infection, either something like C. diff, if they may be working in a hospital, something like this, or food poisoning. Antibiotics can be related as well. And then there's other elements, like it seems to run in families, and it also seems to be more prevalent or more frequent in women than men.
Which is interesting, because my mom has it, my sister has it, and I have it. And so there's, it's only so many people in a family can have it. But before you start to question, is there a genetic component to this? You know, if we were all 6'7", I'd be like, oh, there's a genetic component to this for sure. And I feel IBS is similar. With that, then the treatment, and we mentioned there about low FODMAP, and that is a go-to for a lot of people. And there's a lot more to it. So diet plays a role, and we're going to unpack mental well-being, sleep, movement, because for me, even to this day, sleep and stress are my two biggest triggers. I've got quite a good control of nutrition personally in my own life and what foods work for me, what foods are triggers. But if I don't manage my sleep and I don't manage my stress management, my IBS still flares up to this day. But talk to us about diet and nutrition first, and some of the mistakes that people make, or some of the things they should consider when it comes to the approach.
Yep. So let's start with the low FODMAP diet, because that's kind of where we left off a little bit earlier. So the low FODMAP diet, as I mentioned earlier, is a diet to pinpoint triggers. Now, what we do is we go on a restrictive phase for 4 weeks. Now, what people will often do, though, is they don't understand that this is only a temporary change, and they'll be on the low FODMAP diet for years even. And the problem is yes, they may feel better with their symptoms, but the issue is that FODMAPs are also prebiotic foods. So we know from research that even in 4 weeks, it actually lowers the levels of good bacteria in the gut. And this is in somebody whose levels of good bacteria are already altered. So if they continue on this diet, the symptoms initially are quite good, but over time, it's actually doing more damage to the gut, unfortunately.
With foods, and this is just to kind of use a little bit of anecdotal experience here, I went plant-based several years ago. Now I eat meat and fish and stuff now more as an experiment when I was doing kind of ultra endurance events. And the problem with plant-based nutrition, as you are probably going to attest to here, there are certain very high trigger foods that are plant-based that are quote unquote very healthy for you, for the general population. But for somebody with IBS, particularly if it's a trigger, it can, there was foods I would eat and I would look like I was 3-6 months pregnant after those foods. It's ridiculous, the transformation that can happen in both genders. What are some of the more common foods? And I don't want to, put you on the spot with it, but from your experience of working professionally with people, the quote unquote healthy foods, the nutrient dense foods that tend to be quite high trigger for a lot of people.
Yeah. And this word healthy, I think as a dietitian, we hate, because really, what is a healthy food? It's not really a healthy food, is it? And just, I think people need to remember that when they're listening to this podcast. Don't feel guilty if you're not eating a certain way or something like that, because actually what's healthy for one person is going to be different to somebody else. But yeah, so the foods that I guess get put on this pedestal is things like a very much plant-based diet. And even people who've got IBS, they can manage to do that if they want. But some of these foods that we then rely on for like protein sources and iron sources, so like your beans and your pulses particularly, these are highly fermentable foods. So that means that as soon as they hit your large bowel, the bit right at the end of your gut, they're going to create a lot of gas, draw in a lot of water, and create symptoms. Even in people that don't have IBS, if they switch, from having maybe very few of these foods overnight to deciding they want to be vegan, then they can have quite a few problems, because it's just really difficult for the gut to digest it. That doesn't mean that they can't never do it, but there just needs to be some sort of modifications in there, and it can be really difficult. So those sorts of foods are particularly difficult. These really high fiber foods, fruits, vegetables in high quantities. The other one that I see a lot of is, I never know how to pronounce it, but is acai bowls? I always get told I pronounce it wrong.
Yeah, the acai bowls. Yeah.
You know the one. So things like this, they're really, popular, really trendy, but the fructose content, which is fruit sugar, is so high in it that the small bowel where normally this gets digested, it can only have so much at once before it becomes overloaded. And in anybody, this can happen, but definitely somebody who's got IBS, huge fruit loads can be an issue as well. And again, smoothies, these fruit bowls, they get heralded as being super healthy, but actually they can cause quite a few issues.
With the foods in particular, because I think this is a very interesting part for people because it's so context dependent, but you're the person to ask, Kirsten, because you're an expert in this. Is it normally the same type of foods? Obviously, you mentioned the fermented foods there, etc. But something that I'm using from my own personal life here, certain foods affect me that don't affect my sister. Certain foods affect my sister that don't affect my mum. And there's a little bit of a different level of tolerance that each one of us can take with certain foods. Is that common, or is that a common experience for people, that there's different trigger foods that people have that work worse for them or better for them in some contexts? Or some keys in that context?
Yes, absolutely. And that's why if anyone looks at my Instagram content, I'll often see I use words like foods that may cause bloating because they are typical triggers, but for different people, they'll have, different tolerance levels. For example, like even someone who has a genuine lactose intolerance, they will be able to manage still small amounts before it becomes an issue. And we know from research that the best thing you can do for your diet is have, a variety. So you want to work within those own tolerances rather than following someone on Instagram going, look at my diet today. This is what I've done for my gut health. Well, guess what? It's not going to work for yours. And that's why I'm also quite careful on social media, not to necessarily share my whole day's diet, but because for somebody else, that could be a real trigger for them. So everyone is different. And that's why it's important to work very systematically through that low FODMAP process to find out what your triggers are and also how much of that food you can tolerate before it becomes an issue.
Is there any red flag no foods that you've never met a person who has IBS that was able to tolerate it? Fatty foods, red wine, dark chocolate, some of the triggers. Is there any food that falls into that category, or is it really independent or dependent on the person?
Yeah, it's really independent. There is not one single food that I would outright ban.
Good. That's for people listening, because I think with IBS, and I knew your answer was going to be that from following your content, but people tend to go, this food's a no-no without ever testing it because they read it somewhere or it came up on a podcast or on a blog post or on Instagram that someone says this food is bad for IBS. I cannot have it. But as you mentioned there, you need to experiment and test it. So one of the things I try to do with people on this podcast, it's the education around what can you include versus just what can you remove, because sometimes with nutrition, that's the way that you can adhere to a plan. With diet then, and moving on from that, because I think it's a huge part, mental well-being is really important. And as somebody that to this day, and I can't remember, I'd say I've 20 years now with IBS, definitely from the age of 15 was when it first started to rear for me. And it took me probably 6 years to get it under control and probably more like 10 before it was really manageable. But my stress and my mental well-being really affects it. If I'm going through a stressful time at work or a family issue or anything along those lines, my IBS flares up. Talk to us about the importance of mental well-being in regards to IBS.
Yeah, mental well-being is absolutely crucial. To the point where, and I'll put a positive spin on it to start with, I have got a client who recently said, I'm so confused. None of the FODMAPs seem to be a trigger for me because we've worked through the whole process. And it was because when we first started working together, her stress was completely out of control. And now she's not stressed. And that's the difference it can make. It can make you really sensitive to foods. And we know things like chronic stress can lead to chronic pain signaling to the brain. So there is something called hypersensitivity in IBS where there is not every symptom, but there is an element where there's actually nothing going on in the gut, but your brain will read it as I'm in pain, for example. And we know that's linked to stress, to depression. So mental health is absolutely crucial when it comes to probably all areas of health, to be honest, but IBS especially, yes.
Do you have any stress management techniques that you think are beneficial for the majority of people?
Yeah, and I just jump in before I go into techniques and say, I am a dietitian, so I don't take people through therapy sessions. And of course, mental health, it's not like we could test someone's blood and say, okay, so you're 5 out of 10. This is the therapy you need. If anyone is listening to this, and you do have symptoms of things like anxiety, depression, you do just speak to your doctor and find out what, resources are available, because you might need actually a therapist. You might need medication, and you may as well get all the information to see what's available. But in terms of just day-to-day stress, general anxiety, so things like meditation are particularly very good, because actually our brain has got something called neuroplasticity in it. Some words I'm finding difficult to say today. I don't know why I use neuroplasticity, but essentially what that means is, imagine you're in a stressful situation, you've had a crappy day at work, and you immediately get, really quite stressed with that. Your brain starts going around in circles, etc. If you practice moments of being very calm, then what we find is over time, instead of your brain taking that pathway during a stressful event, it then takes a different pathway. So you essentially, even though it's only 10 minutes of meditation that day, then when you experience stressful events going forward, your body is more likely to be able to cope with that in a better way. So meditation personally has changed my life. I'm a huge stress person all the time. Don't know if it's part and parcel of having our own business. I'm not sure. But meditation is fantastic. It's only 10 minutes. And the ironic thing is, if you find it very difficult, you're probably someone that really needs to do it. So take your time with it and just treat it as the same thing as, when you went to the gym the first time. You're probably going to feel like an idiot. You probably won't be able to do it very well and it'll feel really awkward. But over time, you'll start to see the benefit and just keep practicing it. But meditation is probably the number one. And then probably going into sleep from that.
This is a little bit of a chicken and egg scenario, because for me, I'm normally quite good with stress management, from journaling, meditation, heat exposure, cold exposure, things that all work quite well for me in terms of keeping my stress levels balanced. But if I've slept poorly, I find that my ability to cope with daily stressors is way down to what it normally is. Are they very closely tied together, meaning that when you're not sleeping well, obviously cortisol is higher, stress hormone, you just feel more stressed? Or is there another mechanism or something else going on with sleep? Why is sleep so important for IBS?
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that poor sleep can worsen IBS, but very grey area in terms of the exact mechanism. My guessing would be partly that it's impacting your brain, your mental health. We know there's loads of research connecting the brain and the gut there. And it can even do things like, if you have poor sleep, we know it changes what people want to eat, how much food they eat even. So that can be a huge impact. But we also know the circadian rhythm, which is like your internal body clock of how you sleep, is impacted by the gut and vice versa. So it can cause things like constipation. If anyone's ever traveled before on a plane, you arrive on holiday, you think, great, got a few days away, and you spend the first few days trying to go to the toilet, not great. And that's because of that circadian rhythm has been shifted. And so that often happens in a lot of people. But if you've got IBS, even doing things like changing your bedtime from an hour early, an hour later each day, is going to make your body a little bit confused. So sleep is hugely important for IBS.
You mentioned there going to the bathroom, which I think is one of those topics that people are delighted to listen to people speak about, but won't speak about themselves, because we're all kind of curious about, particularly with IBS. Do you find, and this is kind of personal as well in terms of curiosity, is it mostly constipation related IBS, diarrhea related IBS, or is it a 50-50 split? Do you find people tend to skew one way or the other as a majority, or is it people tend to be dominant in one or the other?
Nope. Literally 50-50, and some people have mixed types, so they go from one to the other. But those people who do have mixed type, it tends to be, when you look at the symptoms, one's more dominant. So sometimes people go for a few days of constipation, you're getting backed up, it's building up. And then when you do then open your bowels, it's a lot all at once. And then they have looser stools, or they're trying to use medication sometimes to manage it. But sometimes people use too many laxatives and they end up with loose stools, or they use too much loperamide to try and control loose stools because they're anxious. They think they won't make the bathroom. Then they end up constipated. So, but generally a mix.
You had a great post recently about the things to, it wasn't, I'm paraphrasing now, but things to not apologize for when you have IBS. And one was that, not going out or social outings. And I used to get made fun of my friends when I lived in London, because I could literally have a flare up on a Friday and I'm like, lads, I can't go out. I was like, look at my stomach. And it's such an awkward social thing that I think people don't, because it's one of those, it's not, you're not going to die from it. You're not going to have any, be going into a doctor every 2 weeks, getting checks and blood done, etc. But it's one of those things that has a huge impact on your quality of life. And I think when you firstly understand that it can be treated and managed, that gives you a lot of empowerment. But also there's people out there giving you that advice and making you feel like you're okay. There's other people that have the same thing, because it feels very isolating when you're, sitting in a toilet by yourself, or you don't want to go out because you look like you're 6 months pregnant. And I think it's really empowering that we're able to have this conversation. So I'm really grateful for that. And I want to pull on to that final piece of the take control method, which is movement. And this is, I'm just going to anchor it, and I don't want to take over too much here, but just with movement, I found that the danger was always in the dose with me. If I train too little, I don't feel it's managed in terms of stress management, because that's one of my tools for stress management. But if I train too much, it goes the other way completely. And I have worse flare-ups than when I'm not working out and training. Talk to us about the importance of movement, and then go into the importance of finding the sweet spot for what works for you as an individual.
Yeah, so really, really good topic. And I think I'm going to end up giving you some good advice personally from this as well. So with movement, the reason I use the word movement is because I think with exercise, especially my generation anyway, and probably other generations, we think about maybe the way we look and calorie burning, which is really sad when we think about all the positivities of actually what exercise can do with us. And we also think unless it's going to be some hardcore like CrossFit exercise, it's not, counted or whatever. But actually movement is just literally moving. So for someone that might be a CrossFit class, for other people that might be getting out in the garden and doing some gardening, that your body will benefit from all sorts of movement. And how it benefits the gut is it benefits your brain firstly. So you're going to feel better, you're releasing endorphins, that's going to help with things like depression, improving mood, and that's going to then impact the gut. But it can also help with bowel motions. If someone's constipated, if they go for a walk, we know that can help stimulate them to go. So that's another a benefit there. And especially exercise outside, if someone is consistent with their exercise or movement, whatever you like to call it, we know that actually the microbiome can start to show beneficial changes as well. So there's loads and loads of benefits in moving for the gut. Now, in terms of how you use movement, and I've actually changed my opinion in recent years on this because I used to use movement from a stress management point of view as well, working really hard, trying to be not trying to be, but I am a perfectionist, which we're trying to work on recovering. So you're constantly working, really stressed out. And then I'd go and hit the gym really, really hard. And I'd come out and I feel great, right? Next day again, next day again, next day again. And you think this is great. I'll be posting on Instagram, move, exercise. It's so good for you, blah, blah, blah. Probably people were sick of me seeing it. And realistically, all I was doing is yo-yoing from one extreme to the other. So all day I was hammering the stress, getting to that really high level of stress, and then managing it by really putting my body through this extreme workout. So that's probably not the best thing to do. I mean, other people use drugs and alcohol, so it's probably better than that. But it's not a sustainable management tool if that's what you're doing to manage the stress. So what I would say to you is just probably have a realistic look at your lifestyle. And if it is actually the actions that I'm doing in the day, whether that's work, whether that's actually other stresses in life, financial, relationship, whatever, I think you need to be looking at how can you reduce that actual input of stress, as well as actually managing the stress as well once it's in your system, rather than just trying to manage and cope with it continually.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice, Kirsten. And you mentioned there, unrelated, but you mentioned drugs, and that brings me on to medication for IBS. And something that happened to me, and I'm sure several of your clients and people you've worked with were the same, that when you get diagnosed with IBS, I wasn't told about low FODMAP. I wasn't told about mental well-being. I wasn't told about sleep. I wasn't told about movement. I was told, here, take your Buscopan. Here, take your tablet. Here, take your pill. Do you find that, and again, you were probably one of the best people to ask on this because of your experience, that's where a lot of, and this isn't to knock Western medicine or doctors or anything along those lines, but do you find that that tends to be their first order of call to action or protocol is, here's the tablet to help with the spasms of the intestine or whatever it is in terms of explanation, and they don't explain more of it? Is that the kind of first call to action that tends to happen with most doctors or Western medicine?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really difficult one because medication has a place. If you are someone at the minute that can't work because of your IBS, you can't socialize because of your IBS, etc., take the damn medication if it's there and it's going to work for you. Absolutely, that medication does have a place. But as we said, lifestyle and diet, there's so much more that can be done. Now, what I find really frustrating as a dietitian is if you went to your doctor tomorrow and you had a broken ankle or, I don't know, like a sprained ankle, they wouldn't sit there and try and diagnose it. They would refer you to a physio. But for some reason, when you go in with IBS and they've done the due diligence, they've done the test that they should have done, they diagnose you. Why are people not being referred to dietitians? And this might be to do with resources, lack of understanding. I don't know. And then it even goes one step further where people start getting given, these low FODMAP diet sheets and trying to do it on their own. And if you read any medical guideline, it says this diet should only be done with a dietitian. So I have no idea, but very, very frustrating.
And I will echo that, Kirsten, that one of the biggest mistakes, and I won't say I made this intentionally, but it was 20 years ago, 10 years ago when I was trying to get it under control. It was before Instagram, before people like you were putting out great information. I tried to do it all myself. But if I could give advice to somebody in a starting position, struggling now, is work with a professional. Come through your program, your course, work with a dietitian, work with a professional, and cut out all that learning curve, because otherwise you're going to be going back and forth, and there's a million different things that can confuse you, because I've been down that road and I've seen that path, and it's not a very pretty one, particularly with IBS. I won't get into any of the visuals, but you can imagine in terms of TMI information. But with the mistakes that people tend to make, what's the biggest one that you see? And again, another Pandora's box of a question, I know, but is it through the diet, the mental well-being, the sleep, the movement, or something else? What's the biggest single mistake you see most often with people that you're working with, or people who are following you online?
Just diet. So they focus all on their diet, and then they start restricting one thing. Normally it's gluten, because Dr. Google says gluten causes problems, and it doesn't. And then the next thing will probably be dairy. And then they think, I think I got a little bit better. And then it goes a few weeks, and then they start restricting something else. And they're like, and then they start on maybe a random supplement. And it's just that kind of one thing after the next. And someone ends up on a whole concoction of supplements. They end up on a very restricted diet, really poor relationship with food. And despite all this effort, the symptoms still aren't great. And it's this kind of slow burner. That's what we tend to find, unfortunately. So most people who come to work with me, sometimes they've been having these symptoms for years. And you say, what have you tried? Everything. And, they're almost a little bit dubious about whether someone like me can actually even help them. And they haven't done anything correctly. They've done it all out of order. It's been just a bit of a mess, but bless them. They put in loads and loads of effort, because when you've got IBS, you're really motivated to try and get things better. But it's just been all the wrong things in the wrong order, unfortunately.
Yeah, thankfully, pain is a great motivator for change. If you're feeling physical pain, you're seeking things out. But with that, it can lead to that action bias where you're taking too many steps in the wrong direction, and it can lead to frustration and confusion. And you're literally a gut punch there. That was literally me getting rid of gluten, getting rid of dairy, taking supplements to the point that I had, I'd say, 50 on a table. And that's a pinpoint of my life 10 years ago. With supplements, do you think they have a time and a place, or is it a case of they're unnecessary for the majority of people? What's your kind of thoughts on that?
It's funny you should ask this, because whenever I do inquiry calls with people, one of the questions is, will you be advising me on supplements? And when I'm like, well, most people don't need supplements, and they're almost disappointed, so they want to be told this is what you need. But occasionally I'll use some fiber supplements if someone needs a boost, but normally obviously we're trying to get that from diet. Occasionally we use a probiotic, but it's never life-changing. It's maybe a little edge on their symptoms, but that's probably about it.
Yeah, I think definitely nutrition first. Supplement what you're missing in your nutrition. I think that goes for weight loss, fat loss, building muscle, IBS, all the way across the health, wellness, and fitness spectrum. Kirsten, you obviously struggled for so long, and it's led you down this path to helping so many other people, because you know firsthand. And again, you could go in a million different directions with this, but what's something that you know now that you wish you knew back when you started?
I wish I knew that I didn't have to put up with the symptoms. So I thought, I've got tested, and I actually got diagnosed with celiac disease to start with. So I thought, I should be grateful that there's nothing else, because you start to get all these things in your head, and then you just put up with the symptoms. And I don't think it's until either something really bad happens or you get symptom relief, you realize how bad it got. It was impacting how I felt about my body, relationships that I had, even my mental well-being, my energy, my career to a certain extent. My mental health probably was the worst. I was on antidepressants, everything, you name it. It was happening in my life. And it just kind of makes me really sad to look back at that 20-something-year-old and think it didn't have to be like that.
With the mood and the depression, and again, I'm somebody that struggled with the same thing, and hindsight is obviously 2020. I can look back and realize that there was a huge gut microbiome IBS linked issue because of, you mentioned earlier, the gut-brain axis and that link. Is that something that people aren't as aware about as they should be, that there's a link between your gut and your mood, your anxiety, your mental health? And again, you're in this space, but when I say it sometimes with clients, and I don't work with them with IBS, that's why I'm glad we have this conversation. People can go check out your books, check out your, which we'll get onto later, book. We'll talk about that later. Your course and program. They don't know that, well, there's actually a huge tie between your mood, your mental health, and your gut. Do you find there's a lack of education around that still?
Yes, lack of education, or the other thing we see is very unhelpful comments. So people will say, it's probably your stress. Well, it probably is, but there's no like, what do you do about that? There's no kind of like, well, how do you even start to reduce that down? And people start thinking, but I have this job, or I have kids, or whatever the stress is causing them, that they don't know how to move forward with that. So sometimes it is a lack of education. As I said, the first thing we think about in IBS is diet, what we can do to what we're eating. But then even if it is highlighted to them, maybe it's stress, maybe it's your mental well-being, there's no support. It's just, oh, okay, now I know there's a connection. What am I supposed to do about that?
Yeah, I think that's something that I wish I knew, that if you look after your gut and you look after your IBS, for me, it's managing. I always think of it's like sweeping the floor. You can sweep the floor today and it'll be clean, but if you don't stay on top of it, it'll get dirty again. And IBS is very much like that. And the one thing I wanted to ask you, and this is when I was scrolling through Instagram and I follow your content and I was researching this podcast and I didn't come across it. And I'm very curious, as someone that definitely has a mixed experience with this, fasting and intermittent fasting or prolonged fasting and IBS. Talk to us about that.
Yes. So this is a huge topic, fasting in general. I'm not going to go into other areas. We'll just stick in my lane of IBS because it can become very controversial, as you probably know. So with fasting, when we say fasting, there's various different types of fasting, at different hours, different times, etc. The research we've got in IBS specifically, which we have to understand, the research is a very specific population, is limited. So what we do know is people who have irregular meals, they report that their symptoms are worse. What irregular means is probably skipping meals or having meals particularly late. Now, my theory behind that is probably that if you think about, you need to get X amount of fiber per day and X amount of calories per day, especially if your gut's already sensitive and you're cutting out maybe 1, maybe 2 meals per day, that actually makes it quite difficult to get what you need all in one meal. And we're not just talking about calories. We're talking, even if you are someone trying to lose weight, fiber is really important, for example. So it's not very recommended. However, we do know equally on the other side that potentially if you are sort of somebody that snacks all day, is eating just continually, then that's not really giving your gut a break. So in the gut, there is something called the migrating motor complex, which is, I'm going a bit sciencey here, guys, so stick with me. It's basically like a part of the nervous system, and it flushes the gut. And this can happen up to every 4 hours. It just happens. We don't know what's going on. And this is in everybody. And there is a theory that if someone is snacking all day, then this doesn't work, because if you have something in your stomach, this flush doesn't happen. So if you're somebody that's having a breakfast and several snacks and a lunch and several snacks and just constant eating, that flush may not work as well. And it's all very theoretical, but this may then be linked to bacterial overgrowth in the small bowel. But whether that is linked to IBS and what those links mean and what kind of advice we need to give, we're not sure. So what I would say to anyone with this is, I would say, look to see what your own triggers are. So if you are fasting for other reasons and you find that actually you feel better for that for other health reasons, not for IBS, because we think it might make IBS worse, then just look at your own symptoms. Do they get worse while you're doing this or not? And if they don't, crack on. And if they do, then maybe just stop it, and now you know why. So I think at this stage where there isn't concrete evidence one way or the other, we just have to personalize it to the person.
With that, and I know your answer is going to be personalize it to the person, but you mentioned regular meal timings, and that's something that I've experimented with fasting, and as I mentioned, very mixed results. I found with my IBS in particular, I felt amazing when I wasn't eating, but then as soon as I ate, I just felt like my digestive system had literally gone to sleep and said, you know what, we don't need to, we haven't been feeding us, go away, what are you doing? And it would just, my stomach would swell off the back of it. So I eventually let go of that and stopped doing prolonged fasts. But I found regular meal timings something that I kind of fell into as somebody that has a kind of a sporting background and a bodybuilding background. That regular meal timing helped me quite a lot. Is that something that's generally recommended, or is it really a case by case scenario?
No, generally recommendation would be breakfast, lunch, dinner, really old school, going back to that. And then plus or minus snacks, depending on, what you need in the day, because obviously everyone's calorie requirements are different and things like that. And snacks can be a good way to get those boosters in. But breakfast, lunch, and dinner, I personally find if clients are skipping a meal, they're missing a time in the day that they could use to actually help trigger their gut to have a bowel motion. They're missing 30% of their opportunity to get that fiber in. So it does get more difficult. So generally speaking, my clients are 3 meals a day plus.
And I'm going to ask another controversial one alongside fasting: caffeine or coffee and IBS. And again, very mixed results. Personally, I can't stomach coffee on an empty stomach. I need food in my stomach and then I'm fine. Otherwise, it doesn't go very well for me. What's been your experience with clients? Again, it's going to be context dependent on the person, but generally, just so that people have an idea if they're trying to, experiment with things themselves. What about not caffeine, coffee in particular?
Yeah. So coffee, yes. So sometimes I actually use it for clients and sometimes we have to cut it down. So coffee itself, the active ingredient is caffeine, which is a stimulant. So it's going to stimulate your bowels. Now, for someone with a slower gut, that might be really beneficial. So something like a coffee in the morning could actually help them actually open their bowels in the day, and that's great. But if someone is particularly looser stools, then that's not going to be necessarily the best thing. So it really depends on the person. The other thing to consider as well, though, is caffeine has been linked to worsening anxiety. So it wouldn't necessarily cause someone to have anxiety, but if you already have anxiety, then potentially reducing down or cutting out coffee is going to be beneficial. There's obviously a link between the anxiety and IBS. And I know for me personally, for example, I go through periods where I am more anxious and I then cut out my caffeine because the last thing I need is more stimulation at that point. But one benefit is even if you are someone that can't tolerate caffeine, if you want to get the benefit of what we call polyphenols, which is in coffee, then you can still get that benefit from having decaffeinated coffee. So there's something to hold on to.
And green tea would have a small amount of caffeine as well, and you get the polyphenols as well. So there's a nice little add-on for people. As I mentioned, Kirsten, love what you're doing, the work that you've done. I think for anyone that's struggling, the biggest mistake people make, particularly with this area, is trying to figure it all out themselves. And sometimes on the podcast, it's just about educating yourself so you can go and make the changes, make the adaptations yourself. For some listening to this, that will be what they need to do. This will be the missing or the figurative 9 to a 10 that they just needed those little top ups. For the majority, look for help. And I think, Kirsten, with what you're doing with your program, with your course online, is doing that for people. So before I get into the final question, do you want to talk a little bit about the program, the course? And I mentioned the book earlier, but you have mentioned it on your Instagram, so I don't feel too bad because it's not a secret, it's a public secret. So talk to us about the program, the course, and potentially the upcoming book. I know you announced it in December. So talk a little bit about that before I get into the last question.
Yeah, that's great. Nice plugs there. Thank you. So with the course is called Take Control, which is obviously comes from the concept of taking control of this IBS rather than IBS taking control of you. And it's for anyone that's got an IBS diagnosis. And essentially what it does is it gets you from where you're at now. So, someone that's maybe having to worry about what they're wearing, their energy is zapped, they're anxious about eating, their relationship with food is just shite, really not in a great place, to knowing exactly what the triggers are, and even better, actually improving their gut health. So knowing the triggers bit is only part of it. It's actually improving the gut health. And how it does this is it's a 12-week online course. So you sign up, you get access immediately, and it takes you step by step through the science. But this is not just another way to become more educated. It shows you each week how to apply that science to you and your situation. And then we have weekly group calls. So you can come and ask questions, either, anonymously, or most people start anonymously. And then after a few weeks, they don't really care because they realize everyone's in the same boat. But you've got that support throughout, essentially.
And then the book, when is the planned release for that? I know you're working on it now. I saw it on your Instagram stories today. When's the planned release?
Yeah, so the book, and so I can't talk too much about it. I can say that I've been really, really lucky to get a book deal with Bloomsbury. So that will be out next year, hopefully springtime sometime. But yeah, really good. And we're just hoping it's going to be like the last thing people need to buy, because I just think with IBS, it's just like another supplement, another book. And what I noticed about all these books, there's so many gut health books and we all diligently buy them, don't we, hoping we're going to get this little nugget of information, but they just teach us more about IBS or more about gut health, but it doesn't actually teach us how to resolve the situation. And with this, it's going to be very much the science, but again, that practical, well, what do I do? And it's going to teach you how to follow everything step by step.
I look forward to that personally when that comes out. We might even do a round 2 if you need help going through that book. So we'll stay tuned, and everybody listening, stay tuned for it. Kirsten, the last question I want to ask, you've got a good following on social media and you put out great content very consistently on there. But I'm curious, if you had access to Instagram TikTok, Facebook, the social media platforms, and you could send a message that would hit everybody on those platforms who has IBS, what would you say to them?
Oh, difficult question. That's probably my message probably wouldn't go on Instagram because it'd be so long. It'd be don't oversimplify it. IBS is complicated and you need a multifactorial approach.
Oh, I love that. What a wonderful way to end it, because certain things can be simplified down. I think weight loss, fat loss, body composition, a lot more of a straightforward process. And there's a million different ways to potentially hit the same end results. I think IBS, as somebody that's suffered myself and manages it now, it's a little bit more complicated. There's no little bit, it's a lot more complicated. And it took me probably 10 years to get to the point where I felt comfortable even telling people I had it. Don't mind actually managing it myself. So I think for those who are listening now, hopefully this is the podcast that opens up that conversation with yourself to work with a professional to follow the next path or follow the next step down the right path. Kirsten, thank you so much again for what you're doing. I'm really looking forward to the book when it's out. I know it's next year. It's a long time away, but I'll be continually following and picking up nuggets of gold from your Instagram. So thank you so much again for your time. And thank you so much again for all you do.
Thank you for having me.
There you have it, the IBS dietitian Kirsten Jackson on common food triggers, the problem with low FODMAP diets, and finally taking control of your IBS. This is one of these episodes that I think I could have talked about all day as somebody that struggles and knows the frustration that comes with IBS. And in my case, definitely in the beginning, the lack of education around it and following the wrong paths and doing the wrong things that just made me feel more frustrated and more anxious and more upset with myself. So hopefully today's podcast helped to bridge that gap if you were in a similar position. If it did, definitely let me know. Take a screenshot, pop it up in your Instagram stories, or pass it on with any friends or family members who struggle. I think there's this type of episode is one that can make you feel like you're not alone. It can make you feel and come unstuck if you haven't been getting the treatment or the results that you want with IBS. So that's everything from me from this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed recording it. Get you all next Monday.